Okay, before I start take you inside the hangar, I'll introduce myself. My name's Tom Potter. When we get inside the hangar, it can sometimes get very noisy in there, especially when the jets are flying around. Also, it's a working environment in there, so it gets noisy with the guys banging their bits and pieces about. Now, at times you're going to be up very close to the aeroplanes when you're inside the hangar. Please resist the temptation to reach out and touch them. They are not as sturdy as they look, some of them. Also, please stay together in the group. Do not go wandering off by yourself. The RAF don't like you wandering about inside their hangar, and they've got snipers up in the roof and they'll pick you off if you go wandering off by yourself. In the unlikely event that there's a fire, I shall lead you out of the nearest fire exits, which are all on this side of the hangar, which is where we're going to be. Also, there are some trip hazards as we go down through the hangar, so just be aware of where you're putting your feet. I don't want you falling flat on your face because it's nice hard concrete in there. So, without any further ado, we'll go inside. Okay, if you'd like to come in a little bit closer, please, so I don't have to shout too much. Right, good morning everybody, welcome to RF Coningsby. Now, before I start telling you about the aeroplanes, I'll give you a little bit of this history lesson into how all this came about in the first place. At the end of the Second World War, it was customary for the RAF to hold a flypast over central London. That was in order to celebrate the victory in the Battle of Britain, and it was always led by a Spitfire and a Hurricane. At the end of the war, that was easy to do because there were still plenty of those aeroplanes flying around. But as they went out of service, it became more and more difficult to find those aeroplanes in order to take part in the flypast. So way back in 1957, at RF Biggin Hill in Kent, the station commander there, a man by the name of Peter Thompson, had the last flying Hurricane in service for the RAF. He also managed to get his hands on 3 Spitfires, and they formed what in those days was called the Historic Aircraft Site. And that was 60 years ago last Tuesday. So they had a little bit of a celebration here last week to celebrate that fact. So he got these 4 aeroplanes. They formed the Historic Aircraft Flight, and its function in those days was really just to perform a ceremonial and commemorative occasions. So they just to fly past over those events. Whereas these days it's broadened out a little bit. They still do all that sort of thing, but also of course they display air shows up and down the country. Sometimes they get over into Europe and do air shows over there as well. Now, in the meantime, they changed their name a couple of times. First of all, it changed to the Battle of Britain Flight, and then it changed to the present name, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. And really, the part that you want to remember is Memorial Flight. Although it was originally formed as a memorial to the Battle of Britain, these days it performs a wider function. The Battle of Britain, of course, still takes a major part of what we do, but really the purpose of the flight these days is to serve as a flying memorial to all of those people who have lost their lives in the service of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Flying Corps, which we see today. So these days it's not just about the Battle of Britain, despite what the name says. So if you just remember the memorial part of it, you won't really go far wrong. Now they stayed at Biggin Hill just for around about a year. It ceased to be a flying station. So they became a little bit nomadic, went to various RAF stations. First of all, they went to North Weald in Essex. From there, they went to Berkshire Heath in Suffolk. Then they moved once more to Orsons and Faith in Norfolk, which is now Norwich Airport. Then they stayed in Norfolk and moved to RAF Coltishall. And then in 1973, the flight moved here to Coningsby, and this is where it's been ever since. So the major part of the existence has been spent here at Coningsby. Coltishall they stayed at for around about 10 or 11 years. The other places they stayed at for very brief periods, sometimes not even as long as a year. So that's the history of the flight. So without further ado, the aeroplanes. So the first one is the one behind me here. Ironically, this is not a British aeroplane. This is an American designer built aeroplane, which is known as a Douglas Dakota, but only by the RAF and Commonwealth Air Forces. Elsewhere it's known either as a DC3 or a C47. DC3 in civilian service and C47 in military service. Very advanced aeroplane for its time. It was first designed and built in 1935. A very advanced airliner. When it first came into service, most aircraft that were flying around in those days, certainly airliners that were flying around in those days, were all biplanes, so they were held together by wire and string and bits and pieces of fabric. So something like this, all metal construction comes along, it's a great leap forward as far as passengers are concerned. The aeroplane actually capable of carrying 28 passengers. Sometimes they reduced that to around about 14 passengers, and the reason they reduced it was because they all got a bed. They called them ductless sleeper transport, so you got on board the aeroplane, lied down in your bed, and then off you went to your destination. But you wouldn't have got much sleep because it's a very noisy aeroplane inside. At least you would have been horizontal and rested by the time you got there. But you would have been slightly deafened as well. So this particular aeroplane, actually built in 1941, first used by the United States Army Air Force. They only used it for around about a year, and then it was passed on to the Royal Canadian Air Force. And they used it right up until the 1970s, and then it was passed on to the Royal Air Force. And it was used just as a trials aeroplane, flying trials on various bits and pieces of equipment, radio and radar stuff. And then in 1994 it came to the end of that job, and that's when it came here to Coningsby. So we've had it since then, and of course nowadays it's all painted up in nice military markings, wartime markings. Now, point out to you that all the aeroplanes that you see inside the hangar have all got these markings on them as would have been worn during wartime. That is really to give me a little story to tell, because every so often the aircraft go through a repaint process. And the reason they go through that repaint process is so that I can tell you a different story about the aeroplane. Because each time it goes through that process, it's painted up to represent that particular aircraft type as it was used by, say, a particular pilot that flew the aeroplane, or a particular crew that flew the aeroplane, or a particular squadron that used that aircraft type, or a particular operation that aircraft type took part in. It does not necessarily mean to say that the aeroplane that you're looking at did all of the things that I'm going to be telling you about. It just represents those other aircraft that were around in those days. Now, when it first came here back in 1994, after being at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where it had been doing all that trials work, it had been painted up in a rather garish colour scheme, which was known as raspberry ripple. So you can imagine it was quite colourful. But of course we paint it up into military markings so that I can tell you these stories. Now, where was I going to go now? Yes, painted up in military markings, and we've actually got the aeroplane for three different reasons. First of all, we do use it as a transport aeroplane. Sometimes they want to ferry bits and pieces around, sometimes ferry people around, especially if they get corporate days. Some big corporation, especially those that support the flight in any way, send a load of people here to come on a nice long visit. If the aeroplane's flying, then they'll stuff them in the back of the Dakota, send them up to Lincoln Cathedral, once around the cathedral, and back down here again. So they get a nice little bit of a jolly, hanging out the back door, taking photographs of Lincoln Cathedral. So all the photographs you see of Lincoln Cathedral from the air, probably somebody hanging out the back of the aeroplane with their little camera phone, taking photographs on their little truck. So, the aeroplane these days, probably that in there. Second reason we use the aircraft is as a trainer. Now, point out to you that all the crews that fly the aeroplanes, they're all volunteers. The only two permanent pilots that we have are the officer commanding the flight and the operations officer. All the other aircrew volunteer to come here and fly these aeroplanes. So they have a normal job within the RAF. They're flying much more modern aeroplanes during the week, and they give up their spare time in order to come here and fly these aeroplanes. A little bit different flying the modern aeroplanes, jets or turboprops, than flying these around. These all have a tail wheel at the back rather than a nose wheel at the front, which all RAF aircraft have these days. And also these are propeller driven rather than jet or turboprop driven. So it's a little bit different flying these to flying the ones that they fly around in their day-to-day job. So when they come here to fly these aeroplanes, they're not just shoved on it, off you go. They've got to learn how to fly these aeroplanes. So those crews who are going to fly the Dakota, most of them will probably also go on to fly the Lancaster as well. If they're going to fly the Dakota only, then they'll do all of their training on the Dakota. But if they're going to fly the Lancaster as well, then they'll do some of their training on the Dakota, and they'll finish off their training on the Lancaster itself. The reason they don't do all of their training on the Lancaster is because that's a very precious aeroplane. There are only 2 of them left flying in the world today. Ours only flies for around about 100 hours a year, so we don't want to use up all of that time just training people how to fly it, so they'll do as much as possible in the Dakota, and then when it's absolutely necessary, they'll get in the Lancaster and start flying around. The third reason we use it is used as a display aircraft, so either sitting here in the hangar, being able to tell people about it, or it goes off to the display air show. The markings he's painted up in at the moment are the markings of an aircraft of number 233 Squadron, and that was heavily involved at the time of D-Day, hence the black and white stripes on the aeroplane. You'll see those on some of the aeroplanes, the other aeroplanes that will go down through the hangar. Black and white stripes were known either as D-Day stripes or invasion stripes, and they're there simply as an age recognition, because at the time D-Day took place and in the succeeding days, there were going to be an awful lot of aeroplanes in the sky. Not all of them were going to be too friendly. So the easy thing to do was to paint all Allied aircraft with these black and white stripes, so you knew that if they had them, then they were on your side and you didn't have to worry about them. 233 was heavily involved at the time of D-Day. On the night immediately prior to D-Day, a number of aircraft from 233 Squadron flew some paratroops out to France. The job of those paratroops was to capture some bridges. The reason they had to capture those bridges was because if they hadn't have done that, the Germans would probably have destroyed them. That would have held up the advancing troops once the invasion had taken place, so it would have held them up for quite some considerable time before they could penetrate deeper into Europe. So it was important that they captured and held on to those bridges until the invasion took place. The troops come up to them, and they were able to use those bridges to get deeper into France. So they succeeded in doing that. They captured the bridges, held on to them, and they held on to them until the invading troops arrived, and they were able to get deeper into France without any hindrance to that advance. So then it would have reverted, or 233 Squadron would have reverted to its normal sort of bread and butter operations, and that would have been flying out supplies to the troops on the ground. So anything that they needed, ammunition, food, more men, anything. Flying out initially, this would have been done by picking it out of the back of the aeroplane attached to a parachute, but as the troops advanced a little bit further inland, then they would have got hold of airfields and landing grounds, so the aircraft would have been able to land at those locations, and they would have then dropped off their supplies like that. At this stage they also became involved in casualty evacuation. So they were picking up wounded and injured and bringing them back home for treatment at hospitals over here. On these occasions they were crewed by RF nurses. They became known as the Flying Nightingales, and also because they were flying, they got flying pay, 8p a day. Not even 5p in today's terms, this is old money, but they also got some other little perks for flying around in aeroplanes. They got an orange, they got some barley sugar, and they got a couple of packets of chewing gum, all of which was in very short supply during those wartime years. So getting those little perks was quite something quite nice to have. But they really earned all of this because it was by no means an easy thing to do, because these aeroplanes are totally unarmed. Sometimes they went unescorted by fighter aircraft, so if they were attacked by the enemy, they were really in a dodgy position. So they earned their fruit, their sweets, and their 8p a day. On the way out to France, they would have had parachutes, so if the aircraft was attacked and they had to abandon it, then they could have used the parachute in order to escape from the aircraft. But on the way back, the parachutes were locked away, and they were unable to get to them, because their job was to stay with their charges and tend to them until they got back home. So it was quite a dangerous occupation for these young ladies to undertake. So even back in those days, ladies in the front line, much of is being in discussion at the moment about ladies going into the front line. Back in those days, they were certainly doing their things. So I think that's it with the Dakota. So before I take you down to show you the other.